I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss how we're going to set up the game of Pig. So yesterday you should have watched the recording that gave you a quick overview of if statements. And today we're going to talk about how when we get into more complex projects, we actually need to think about everything we're going to do before we code. Now we're going to build Pig in stages. We're going to build a little piece of it and make sure it works. We're going to go back and modify code, add to code, etc. to add more complexity to it. So we're going to do it in stages. So we know that the rules are that we've got two players. Each one rolls a single-sided die until either they roll a 1 or they decide to hold. Once a 1 is rolled, you don't score anything, you lose your turn. If you roll any other number, you get those points added to your total score. So we're going to keep a running total. And then if you decide to hold, you can also pass off to the next player. The first player to get 100 or more points wins. So if somebody's at 99 and somebody's at 90, and then the person at 99 rolls a 5, they've automatically won because they've reached 100 or more before the other person. And so if you look at this, there was an example that Anna rolls a 5, she chooses to hold. If she rolls a 2 and so on, then she rolls a 1, she loses her turn, and so on. So here's all the information on a quick scenario of how the game is played. So before we even begin to code, there are a lot of things you really need to think about. This is not the simplest game to program. For example, you've got to know whose turn it is. Is it the human player or the computer? Because when the roll is done, you've got to know whose total to add up, and you've also got to know if a 1 is rolled, who to switch the turn to, or if somebody holds, you have to know. So you've got to have some way to determine whose turn it is. You've got to make a decision who's going to go first. Some people will do like a flip of a coin kind of thing and randomly assign who goes first, but I think we're better off, we're just going to pick a player to go first. You've also got to keep a running total during the entire game for each player, and every time somebody rolls you have to adjust that total. You have to have code that checks to see if a 1 was rolled, because at that point you've got to switch players, and you've got to make sure you don't add that 1 to their score. You also have to think about how you're going to make the determination of how the computer is going to play. Are you going to let the computer roll X number of times each time? Are you going to let them roll until they get a 1? Are you going to have a random number that says, okay, roll 3 times, and if they get a 1, of course, they lose their turn, but if not, roll 3 times and hold. So there's a lot of complexity in how you might decide to have that computer take its turn, and you've got to code all that. You also have to have code for the human player that allows that person to either keep rolling or hold. If they hold, you've got to switch players, tally up their points, and so on. You also have to have code that stops the game as soon as somebody gets to 100 or more. So there is a lot of complexity to this code, and these are all things you have to think about, and I may not have even thought of everything. Those are just the things that come to me off the top of my head. The easiest thing to do when we start out is to go ahead into that very top of the code window where you have something like public class form 1, assuming that you did not rename your form but that you have it named as form 1. So at the very top of that code window, and remember, I think in the last lecture I said anything that is dimmed or declared, any variable that's set up there is called global, meaning any button, any label, anything can reference it. If we dim or declare a variable, say behind a button, only the code in that button can access it, and that's a local variable, and that is good, but there are times when that will not work. For example, since we're keeping running totals of these scores, and they have to go from 0 to whatever, and we have to keep an accurate accounting throughout the entire game, we cannot put the variable declaration, the dim statement, behind a button, because every time that button is pressed, it recreates the variable and it wipes out the value that's in it. So every time a person would click roll, if you dim their player total behind that roll button, every time they roll, they're starting back at 0, because that's what happens with the local variable. So we're going to set up some global variables for things that have to persist or last through the entire game. And that's going to be our player total and computer total. So we're going to also create a variable that's going to help us know whose turn it is, and we want that to persist throughout the whole game. We don't want that to be reset every time somebody clicks a button, because then only one person would ever get to play. So we're going to make that a global variable. We're going to declare it at the form level, and we're going to call that whois, and we're going to make it a string. There's a couple ways you could do this with true false values and things, but I think the most straightforward way is going to be to do it with a string variable. And so I want to say, let's let the human player go first. So in order to do that, I'm going to set this whois variable equal to the capital letter P for player. And I'm going to hit return after that dim whois string, hit return, and then I'm going to type whois equals quote P quote. And that is going to, and you're going to see later in my code how that's going to ensure that the player goes first. When I want to switch to the computer, I'm going to change the value from a P to a capital C for computer. Okay, so that's really not that complicated, but it's going to require some flipping around of the two values in that variable to determine whose turn it is. Now we're also going to set up the random number for the die roll, and again that needs to be for the whole program, not just for an individual button. So we're going to set that up right under that whois P line. And we're going to put our private randomizer as new random, and then I want my die to be global. I want any button to be able to access it, and I don't want it to be reset every time a button is pressed, so I've got to declare it up at this form level. So I'm going to put dim die as integer. Okay, and what I should probably do is I should probably go ahead and start it at 0 to initialize it, to flush out any trash that's left over in memory where the computer is going to store this value, and to set it to 0, which is the perfect value for it. So as I was saying, we need to go ahead and we call that initialization when we set a default value for a variable. What happens if you don't do that is, in memory, when the computer picks a memory location, some of the RAM to store the number in, if there's junk left over from that memory location from where you just did a Word document and it was storing some junk in that location, it might not accidentally flush it out, and you could get garbage data and it'll cause your program not to work. So the best thing to do is to go ahead and initialize it. And for us, the default value that makes sense is a 0, because every time they roll, right, we're adding. So if there's a 0 in there and then they roll a 5, 0 plus 5 is 5, and we get the correct value. We wouldn't want to put, say, a 1 in there, because then when the person rolled a 5, we'd be giving them an advantage. They'd have 6. So we're going to start at 0. That's going to be our default. So now we want to put two more variables to hold our scores, and again, we want these to be global, so we're doing them at the very top in that form area. And we're going to dim two, player total and computer total, and I've shortened the names a little bit. And then again, just like with die, we want to flush out that memory buffer in case there's junk left over from the last program that used it, and we're going to start with 0 for each of those scores so we don't give anybody an unfair advantage by starting with 1, etc. So when you're done, you should have this code behind your public, what is it called? Public class form 1. That's assuming you did not change the name of the form from form 1. If you changed it to my form or something, it would say public class my form. So you're going to have your variable set up to determine whose turn it is, and you're going to start it with the player, meaning the player is going to go first. You're setting up your random number and your die. You're initializing die to 0 to make sure there's no garbage data in there. You're setting up two accumulators, basically variables that are going to keep a running total through the whole game. And you're setting both of those equal to 0 to initialize them, to flush out any bad data that might be in there. Okay, so now that's a lot to take in. That's a lot of overhead before you've even started coding anything else. So now we're going to think about coding the roll button. Now, this is going to be a work in progress. We're going to start out with this code and we're going to modify it potentially or change it as we go. But what I'm thinking with this is, the first thing I want to do is generate the actual roll. So if you remember, you take your randomizer .next and you put a 6 in there. That will generate numbers from 0 to 5. So we're going to plus 1 to make sure we always get a number in the range from 1 to 6. Now I've got these two little message boxes in here to help you debug your code. We can get rid of those later. We can set a label to show the die roll, etc. But for right now, just as a quick way, we're going to make sure we know what was rolled so we can verify that our if statement works. And again, we can take these out later. If you don't like the message box, instead of deleting it because you may want to reuse it later, if you put a single quote in front of it, that's a comment symbol, and what that tells Visual Basic is ignore everything after the single quote and it will skip. So if you don't want two message boxes, you just want the die number to pop up, you can put a quote right there and it will skip that line as if it wasn't there, and it will just do the second message box. And this is a single line quote. In other words, the compiler, Visual Basic, will ignore everything on this line and it will skip to the next line. Single line quote. Now this is where it gets a little tricky, because we need to check a couple of things in here and we've got to use if statements to make decisions. We know that if the die is a 1, then we need code here to switch the turn. Notice this is a comment because I've got a single quote in front of it, so Visual Basic will ignore it, but this is a comment documentation to help you understand what's going on. So we've got to put code in here to switch the player's turn. If it's a 1 and whois holds the letter P, then I need to switch it to a C. Okay, now I've got a classic nested if here. I've got one if inside another. So if it's a 1, then we're going to check and see, is it the player's turn? If it is, then we're going to flip the value in that whois variable so that it becomes the computer's turn. Otherwise, if it's not a P, the only thing else it could possibly be is a C. It must have a C in it if it doesn't have a P, which means we need to flip it to P. So I could have done this as well. I could have said else if whois equals C, then flip it to P. That's a little clearer to you, but you don't have to. You could just say else. So I'll leave it to you to decide what you want to do, because the only two possible values we're allowing are P and C. Okay, so notice I've got my else if, and this if ends right here. This statement is done. Now if it's a 1, after it flips the player, Visual Basic is going to give you this little message box saying you rolled a 1 and you lost your turn. So no matter who you are, you've just lost your turn. Now the rest of this if it's a 1, else it's anything else, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, that else is right here, and I tried to line them up visually to help you with that. So if it was a 1, we have one choice, one path to go down, but for the other 5 options, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we're going to come down here. And this is, we still need to know whose turn it is. If it's the player's turn, we need to bump their total up by whatever they rolled. Otherwise, it must be the computer's turn, and we're going to bump their total up. Now you can also do this if it makes it clearer to you. There's 2 ways to do it. And then I've ended this if statement, and this end if goes with this. So I have 2 if statements that are nested within an outer driving if. So you can see this is a little complicated. So I'm going to leave it to you to try to get this code in and see if you can get it working when you click the roll button.